name's Isabella. I'm a tarot reader and a tarot writer, and I'm just coming here to do a little collective 2-card reading about 2 cards in the Suit of Swords. And I think that these two together really kind of outline the journey we're going through in the Suit of Swords, as well as like what the actual emotional and maybe like more primarily mental experience of going through this suit is. We have the Knight of Swords, otherwise known as the King of Swords, and the Two of Swords. And the Knight / King is the final card in the suit, where it starts with the Ace and travels through the 10, Page, Prince, Queen, Knight. So we're at the sort of grand finale of this journey, right? And I like to think about the Suit of Swords as sort of the process of gaining mental control, if that makes sense. The Suit of Swords is all about the world that exists in our minds and how our minds and our perception really shapes our experience of the world. The Suit of Swords, we come across a lot of moments where we learn something new and our entire world is changed because of it. So the Knight of Swords is someone who's gone through this entire process and is now sort of like at the end. I feel like the sort of metaphor of an initiate in some kind of spiritual / meditation tradition is sort of a good protagonist for this sort of journey through the suit. Let's say you're, a potential yogi who really wants to learn how to meditate. And particularly, I feel like the swords, which is all about duality, right versus wrong. Particularly, let's say our meditation path is like a non-dual path. So we start off in this journey with a moment where we realize, where we're maybe forced to confront something really jarring or illuminating in a sense that we can't make sense of what we're starting to learn, and we might want to categorize everything around us as good or bad, but we see through this suit that all things just have meaning, and the meaning is a lot more complex than good and bad. And once we start sort of putting that duality on meaning, we lose out on truly learning the totality of that thing. And I feel like the two is sort of a perfect example of that, because in the previous card, the Ace, we have this sort of flash of illumination, whether it be a eureka moment or through a really difficult experience that sort of shakes our perception of things. And the Two is kind of that process of using the structures of knowledge that you already have, or maybe newly finding a frame of thought to kind of grapple with these things. Like a lot of religious schools or a lot of schools of thought are essentially giving you like a toolkit to move through the world and use as like a mental reference when you come across I want to say ideas in the world, but it's kind of this, in this way that everything you experience holds a greater purpose and greater meaning, and there's a greater idea or plan to all of it. So, that could even be with like tarot. A lot of the way that people first start to learn about tarot in the process of becoming a reader is by doing like a daily pull, where you have a card that's kind of the ruling spirit of the day. And then as you go through your day, everything is reflected back through the lens of this card, and you're able to gain a greater understanding of this idea or this card or this symbol through understanding your entire experience as an expression of it, and then studying that experience and studying your world as a way to gain both like mundane knowledge but also higher knowledge. And when I talk again about this process of like mental discernment or mental perfection, mental mysticism in the Suit of Swords, I feel like it really is about that kind of, again, we come across this idea of like the duality in the Suit of Swords, and especially in the two of like as above, so below, right? There's always a higher meaning and a mundane meaning, and both are important. And again, coming back to this idea of the Two of Swords as this process of mental reflection, it's like, yeah, just learning to take that all in and gain this higher sense and not prioritize one form or the other. And when I talked about like moving through the world with this structure in place to guide you, again, I feel like the Two of Swords kind of talks about like how when we do find a school of thought or a spiritual practice that works for us, it's incredibly comforting to, like, when we truly have faith in that belief, it is very comforting, right? Because then you can more quickly and more easily see the meaning to life in your everyday experience. And that brings peace because you're not struggling to, have something different or want a different fate or a different experience, because you've accepted that as, your lesson, essentially. Like, there's a lot of really intense, religious practitioners of all kinds of faiths, religions, whether they be tantric, agoris, or like born again Christian Scientists, right? Where true commitment to that path and entering into it in a way that it has totally sort of permeated your brain allows you to kind of have it be like, I don't want to say cushion, because I don't necessarily like buy into the whole religion is the opium of the masses type thing, but it is kind of, of that vein, right? Or you can just have that like pure acceptance and learning and understanding. I guess the question is, right, like, are you using this school of thought to just be comfortable and to sort of be at peace and to not really struggle with your environment? Or does this school of thought challenge you to break into those forms of higher learning, or like make higher learning applicable to your everyday life? And I feel like this is where the Knight of Swords really comes in. I've always thought of the Knight of Swords as a very like occult card. Actually, honestly, all the court cards in the Suit of Swords. But I kind of see the Knight of Swords as almost like an Aleister Crowley, who funnily enough had moon in the 9th house of religion, but then went on to be like the greatest occultist. Really, that just came out of my mouth without thinking about it. I would have to think about that more. But simply like one of the greatest occultists that the world has known. In that left-hand path of rejecting traditional religion, rejecting dogma, and kind of being passively fed knowledge. And it's sort of like that true thirst for higher knowledge and that true thirst for, connection of all kinds and learning of all kinds, I think is what disillusions a lot of people from institutional religion, because those schools of thought are not necessarily working for them or speaking to their needs. And for people like Aleister Crowley and many, many, many occultists, it's that same force that kind of pushes you onto the left-hand path of forbidden knowledge and of experiential knowledge and of looking directly into the sources of wisdom that have been forbidden to you or that have been kind of made taboo, and getting your own learning out of them, right? Because I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier of like, if you're only using one type of knowledge, it's not a full picture. And if you're totally pushing out any kind of negative experience, you're not able to learn. And I feel like the Knight of Swords is someone who has really mastered the art of like pushing into that uncomfortable territory and pushing into that like dark night of the soul, and almost gets like a thrill out of like overcoming challenging experiences, because the suit of swords gets like a really bad rap, I think, for people who don't really understand it, because we have cards in it. I mean, it's kind of funny. We pulled like literally the one nice card. Just kidding. I mean, like, again, that's a very dualistic way of describing the suit. But I feel like you kind of have to come at it with this very like neutral, non-dual perspective, because it's not a suit, it's not all about suffering, right? And if you look at it as only about challenges, conflict, pain, sorrow, you're missing out on so much of the wisdom of the suit, which is ultimately about how to use your brain as a tool to overcome these things or to gain learning from these things, rather than be crushed by them and have it just rule your experience of life, which I think actually has to do more with like a lot of the other suits, right? Like your physical, emotional experience of the world, I actually think has to do more with like, you know, cups and pentacles, whereas like the suit of swords is kind of like your brain is always going to be separated from your experiences somehow, right? Like you have your inner self in your mind, whether you have like an inner monologue or not, right? That is completely like, I almost want to say like behind a veil or behind some boundary from the external world, right? You can be going through any experience in the world, and like as long as you have control, like you aren't, you know, like something's happened to your mental, like your mental processes are severely altered in some way, you know, you can always sort of be in control, right? Except that process is so difficult and so unattainable for so many people because they're more committed to comfort and safety and like peace of mind over everything. But then ultimately you're missing out on like how to overcome those things that you're running from completely, right? And to master them and to be able to ultimately use them, right? Like we have the Knight of Swords here, who he always kind of reminds me of, you know, this deck was created kind of in like the World War II era, and I feel like you can really feel that in this card. And it's kind of almost like that crazy kamikaze mentality, right? Where it's like if you completely accept your purpose as like a fighter pilot, when you're doing that, you have to not only like, you know, if your destiny is to be a fighter pilot, like you've probably learned a number one thing is to be able to kind of overroute your fear response and be able to do what you've got to do. And I'm not necessarily like pro-war or pro-violence in any sense of the word, but it really just is that sort of warrior mentality that's really part of, you know, been with human civilization for so long. And again, like, you know, with the Two of Wands and the Two of Swords and the Suit of Swords in general, it's about finding that balance where you're not just like, you know, burning out at both ends either way, not caring. You're also still able to have joy, have peace, have understanding. Because the point of the Knight of Swords and the Suit of Swords in general is not to be in a place where you're just only dwelling in fear and you're only able to kind of use things that are negative. It's about being in a peaceful place and being in a state where you're as open to, you know, learning and wisdom and experience as possible, and you're not closed off in fear and you're not closed off in, you know, stagnancy or in dream. You're just present to really be there and to live your life and make the most out of your experiences. So I'm gonna cut it there. I have so much to say about the Suit of Swords. I'm a triple air sign. The Knight of Swords rules my part of Gemini, so I've spent, and I'm actually a moon in Libra too. That's really funny. So this is very applicable to me. I've thought about these themes a lot, and I still struggle with them every day, but I think one of the main lessons of tarot in general, like when you look at what the tarot as a whole is teaching us, is about how there is like a higher learning to be found in every mundane experience and every emotion. And that's why, hypothetically, the 78 cards are supposed to cover every experience you could have in a human life, right? And tarot is a tool to be able to kind of, you know, sit in this armored car, right, and pass through these things with a place of observation and a place of not necessarily detachment, but of greater, like, you're more aware of the place of these things in the greater picture, right? Yeah, so out of fear of getting too into the cliches, like I said, gonna stop it here, but thank you for joining me. I hope this was useful to you. Bye.